Why are some nations wealthier than other nations? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined, as I am every week, or at least most weeks, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who's a professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners. It's always a pleasure.
You know, Richard, when I first met you in Dallas back in the late 1980s, that was a long time ago, I was taking a tutorial in Austrian economics with the head of the department there, as you know, Sam Bostaff. And Sam said, well, he looked at my reading list and he knew I'd been an economics major. And he says, let's go back to basics. Let's start with Adam Smith's treatise, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, and do a chapter by chapter analysis. And then we'll move forward from there, go to the classical economists, and we'll end up with the Austrians. Well, you know, Smith's title of that book, which was, as I understand it, the first treatise, an organization of the study of economics, intrigued me because it was entitled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And the reason it intrigued me is because the question is, why are there some nations that have higher standards of living and more wealth than other nations? Is it because they have natural resources? Is it because they have a more highly educated citizenry? Is it their political system? You know, what's going on here? And one of the big reasons I was intrigued by this is that, as you know, I grew up on the border, the U.S.-Mexico border in Laredo, Texas. And we were told when I was growing up that Laredo was the poorest city in the United States per capita income. And there was a lot of poverty. I mean, people really lived in shacks in areas of the town that were called barrios. But as poor as Laredo was, as soon as you crossed the river into Nuevo Laredo, I mean, there was real poverty there, and you saw it immediately. I mean, the poverty in Laredo was nothing compared to the poverty in Nuevo Laredo. Now, why would this be so? Because it really is just one great big metropolitan area that's divided by a river. If you look at cities here in the United States, there's a lot of cities that have a river running through the city. In San Antonio, which was near where I grew up, they have a river running through the city, and yet the standard of living on both sides of the river is essentially the same. If I'm not mistaken, I think East St. Louis and West St. Louis are divided by the Mississippi. The standard of living is basically the same on both sides. And we see this phenomenon all across the United States. Yet here you have a big metropolitan area, Laredo, Texas, and Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, divided by a river where there's just enormous poverty on one side of the river and not so much on the other side, or relatively not so much. I mean, could this be the consequence of the Rio Grande? Is there something in the water there that causes this phenomenon? Well, it wasn't until I discovered libertarianism and Austrian economics that I discovered the answer to this seeming riddle. And that was quite a big thing for me because, growing up in the poorest state of the United States, and you just can't help but, feel for people that are living in abject poverty. But when I discovered libertarianism, I realized, the American people discovered how to end poverty, or at least greatly alleviate it and raise the standard of living of mass numbers of people. But unfortunately, the principles that the good founding principles in which our American ancestors discovered the key to ending poverty were later abandoned. But I wanted to do this particular segment on this phenomenon with you because there really is a key. This is what people on the left don't realize. If you take, for example, socialists, they'll look at a society that's very wealthy and they'll say, oh, this is perfect. we need the state to redistribute wealth, because in this society, there's a lot of wealth, but there's a lot of inequality of wealth. There's poor people, but there's very wealthy people. And we need to equalize conditions here, economic conditions. So they use the force of the state to tax the wealthy or the middle class in order to give the money to the poor. The extreme example of this was Cuba. There was, when Castro took over, there was a large amount of wealth in that society. And Castro said, this is fantastic. And he starts seizing all the mansions and the industries. And for the first 2 or 3 years, it's great for a socialist because he's got a lot to play with. But over time, what ends up happening is everybody is now equally poor. Everybody's on the verge of starvation. There are no wealthy people, except maybe the people in the political power. But for regular people, everybody's the same. Everybody's just desperately poor, verging on starvation. So the question, what socialists never ask themselves, Richard, is what is it that causes wealth to come into existence in the first place? They just accept that wealth is a given. But if you start out hypothetically with a society that has nothing, there's nothing to confiscate and give to the poor because everybody has nothing. So somehow or another, wealth comes into existence. And that's, I think, the question that was being asked by Smith. What is it that causes wealth? And that's where Austrian economics or free market economics comes into play, that there's a real reason that's going on here. And it was demonstrated by the United States that you've got people, when they're free to accumulate wealth, there was no income tax in America for more than 100 years. They saved a large portion of that wealth. They put it into banks. The banks would loan it out to the businesses so they could buy tools and equipment. The tools and equipment made workers more productive. That increased productivity for the firms, that enabled the firms to have more revenue, and which then gave them the ability to pay higher wages, real wages, not inflationary wages. And they did that not out of the benevolence of their heart, but because other firms were offering money through competition. And so as this process started growing, you had sound money as part of this, no paper money. You had immigration flows that were increasing productivity, division of labor, more people to do more things. The standard of living of the American people soared all the way. If you look at from 1880 to 1910, it's an incredible period of time in terms of standard of living. If we had stayed on that trajectory, Richard, it boggles the mind to think what America would look like today in terms of enormously high standards of living. But unfortunately, the left won, and they prevailed with their welfare state, and then the right won with their national security state. And here we are today, $31 trillion in debt, the federal government is, which is really American taxpayers, and climbing, out of control federal spending, debt, and savings is abysmally low. So you don't have the savings that result in that accumulation of capital that makes workers more productive and increases standards of living. What do you think?
Well, I think the point you raise, that there's this presumption that wealth is just there to redistribute, a horn of plenty from which more can always be taken and divvied out in some notion of fair shares. When Smith wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations, it was published in 1776. He'd been working on it for more than a decade. We have to realize that before that time, the human condition everywhere for everyone was poverty. Everyone lived, demographers, economic historians have estimated, however crudely and rudely in terms of having a reasonable benchmark to compare thousands of years with each other, people for most of humanity's time on this planet lived on average the equivalent of like between $100 or $300 a year. $100 or $300 a year, however you want to sort of measure that by some basket of something. That all began to change in the late 1700s and then the 1800s. That is the late 18th and into the 19th century. To give one indication, those same economic historians and demographers estimate that 200 years ago in 1820, the world's population was 1 billion. Out of that 1 billion people, the estimate is that somewhere between 85 to 90% of everyone lived in poverty or abject poverty. Poverty was the norm, the normal condition of humanity. Today, there is over 8 billion people in the world, 8 billion people in the world. And out of that 8 billion people, less than 10%, approximately 9%, live in some measured notion of poverty or abject poverty. So there's been ballooning of the world population eightfold from 1 billion to 8 billion. Yet at the same time, to have as a percentage of those populations go from poverty being experienced by around 85, 90% of everyone to less than 10% of everyone. This is a phenomenal changeover in the human condition. Life expectancy, the qualities and the varieties of foods, the ability to have such an increase in productivity that parents do not have to send their child out immediately to work as soon as it has some motor functions, because their own take-home pay and productivity is so low that they can't afford to support a child without that child generating wealth to help feed itself. Today, in increasing parts of the world, and certainly in the Western world, you start out as a baby and you don't even have to think about work, not just through grammar school or high school as it used to be, but now college, postgraduate studies, grants or research supports of increasing number, and 50% of young people go to college. I mean, this is a phenomenal increase in the quality of life, the variety of life, the leisure time of life, however one makes use of it, the material standards of living. 200 years ago, they didn't even have railroads. Railroads were introduced in Great Britain in the 1830s, and they went something like 35 miles an hour, and was concerned that at that speed, the vibration would make the human body fall apart. Well, today you travel around the world in a jet plane in less than 24 hours. So how has human life been so dramatically transformed in what amounts to is this little sliver of time in the history of all of humanity on this planet? And the answer for this are the ones that you were referring to, Jacob. A new way of thinking about human beings and their notion of rights and the basis of human relationships slowly but surely began to be transformed. When Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, these ideas were starting to percolate and beginning to be taken seriously to start influencing policy. The idea, particularly in Great Britain and then in America and then the rest of the world, John Locke's notion that the group does not have a right to tyrannize over the individual. The king should not be an autocrat commanding all those below him, that each individual should be viewed as having certain unalienable rights of life, of liberty, of honestly produced and acquired property, that each individual should respect each other's rights in this fashion, and that human relationships should be not based upon force, plunder, command, fear, torture, intimidation by the political authority, but on the basis of a respectful mutual gains from trade. It's your life and it's your property. And it may, in your life, I cannot force you to do something for me with your labor, and I cannot take something from you that is your rightful property without your voluntary consent in an active exchange, where I give you something that you value more highly than what I want from you, and vice versa. And that this results in this bubbling wealth of opportunity for gains from trade, the incentives for specialization, for higher productivity, the wealth that starts getting generated out of which, as you were saying, people can save a portion of their income, however meager it might be at first, but then that grows. It's invested in productive machinery, tools, and equipment, capital as it's called. That enhances the productive ability in the next round of the process, out of which wealth can not only be available to maintain the capital you've already created, but to add to it. The baker has one oven, and he makes 100 loaves of bread a day. And now he sets aside enough to be able to invest in not only replacing that one oven when it wears out, but to have it joined by a second oven so that he can produce 200 loaves of bread a day instead of one. And out of the greater productivity, he has the capacity not only to maintain two ovens and replace them when necessary, but to add a third oven. Now, in that simple, trivial little example, we see the elemental processes by wealth through saving, investment, work, market-guided activities to produce what consumers want. Starts when I was an undergraduate, and I took a course in economic development theory, it was the idea that the rich countries exploit the poor countries, and countries find themselves in a vicious cycle of poverty. No, once you release market relationships based upon these notions of rights and respect for people in relation to each other, you begin a virtuous circle of prosperity, And it is that has brought about this end of poverty increasingly to many parts of the world. It began in England, in Holland, in parts of Western Europe. It spread to colonial and then America and then the United States. And from there, it is slowly but surely spread out to increasing parts of the world. Until now, humanity is doing something that was only a dream of a handful of visionaries and religious people. The end of human poverty. A world in which, not everybody will be rich, not everybody will be comfortably middle class in some American standard sense, but that image of abject poverty, the child starving to death, emaciated, the parent knowing whether he or his child will have a meal the next day, that will be gone. If the market is left free, and left even more free than it is now with its burdens of regulations and controls, it is not impossible, Jacob, that by the end of the 21st century, at the end of this century, that type of poverty will be gone. The dream of humanity will finally have been passed into history, the end of poverty, and a world in which each person, while not having the same income, will have a degree of comfort and ease in which human life can be bearable, enjoyable, and increasingly have meaning and the opportunities to even be better.
Yeah, and you can look to real life examples of this phenomenon. If we consider Hong Kong, for example, before the takeover, the Chinese takeover, they didn't have any natural resources. They didn't have an automobile industry. They didn't have a steel industry. These things that are supposed to make a nation great. They were all these people just on a rock. And yet they had one of the highest standards of living in the world and growing standards of living because of this principle of economic liberty, of leaving people free to engage in economic transactions without government interference. That was the revolutionary message in what Adam Smith was saying, that when you talk about that people had lived in poverty for eons, there was a simple reason for that, because government was charged with taking care of people. It was just naturally assumed that this is what government does. And government controlled people. They controlled economic activities. They had like anti-speculation laws to protect the poor. And Smith is essentially coming along and saying, I'm turning up this apple cart here, turn it over, that it's your system of taking care of society that is the cause of the poverty. That if you just leave people alone, and that's where the French phrase laissez-faire, laissez-passer comes into play. Let it be, let it happen. Just leave people alone to engage in economic transactions. The standard of living will grow all by itself. And we see this in China, for example. I mean, when you and I were growing up, China was an extremely poor country. It was a totally communist socialist system. And they figured out, well, if we let up on some of these controls, there's going to be wealthy people, and there are wealthy people in China, billionaires, but the standard of living of people generally in society will rise. And that's exactly what's happened. If you compare China, for example, and North Korea, which has done the exact opposite, just maintain this total government control over the economy, I mean, it's worlds of difference. And so here's the problem, though, Richard, that when you have a real, genuine libertarian society, you are going to have disparities of wealth. You're going to have tremendously wealthy people like John D. Rockefeller in the late 1800s. But you also have the huge mass of people that have higher standards of living at the bottom of the economic ladder. I mean, there was a reason why thousands of penniless immigrants were flooding American shores every day, coming away from the countries where government could take care of people with economic control and regulations and welfare, and had endless wars, and coming to a society where government couldn't take care of you. There was no welfare programs, because they saw it as a chance to not only survive, but improve their sense of well-being. So the problem is, why is it that there's still so many people that are resistant to this system? And I think it all boils down to envy. I mean, envy is a sin. It's a very destructive sin, and it afflicts all of us. I mean, we're all human beings, but there's really, as an individual, there's not much you can do about it. You know, you may resent the guy that's got the huge mansion down the street. Okay, well, you're going to have to just figure it out for yourself, how to resolve that conflict within you. But the problem is, they turn to the state and they say, oh, we just really hate the fact that he has more when I have less. And they use the state to start taking away from the wealthy. And that's when the downturn starts, because the whole society starts devolving, not at first, but over time, maybe years or decades, that the pie starts shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Sometimes the society can be more productive and can outpace the destruction that's taking place. That large part describes the United States. I mean, the invention of computers and cell phones and so forth. We've been able to increase our standard of living despite what the state has done for the last 100 years. But you reach a point where the government's spending so much and taxing so much and inflating the currency that it's going to finally start shrinking. And the other point I think it's worth emphasizing that you raised was the concept of trade, that in every trade, both sides benefit, because they're giving up something they value less for something they value more. So you can increase standards of living just through the simple act of exchange. And so the corollary to that is, to the extent that government interferes with this, with tariffs and trade wars and restrictions and so forth, to that extent, they are lowering people's standard of living.
See, the envy, I believe, has been reinforced by a false narrative of how wealth is created, due to the influence and impact of socialist ideas in the broadest sense. And that is, there was a time through a good part, if not most of human history, where human relationships were based upon plunder and exploitation. Roving bands came in and looted and plundered what others had produced, and enslaved some and exploited them to produce things against their will. But then capitalism came along, and capitalism did the opposite. You are not to be a slave. You are a free man. You may not be compelled to work. It has to be based on mutual gains from trade. The terms in which you will be working or employed will be ones that you freely accept. But the socialists, and I'm thinking particularly Marx, but not only him, just did not understand that this was a radical transformation of human relationships. And they read into this that it was just another form of exploitation. Well, formerly it was the lord of the manor who exploited the serfs on his domain. Now it's the capitalist who forces the workers to work because he owns the factory. The change was of the human relationships in institutions were totally misunderstood under the influence of socialist and sympathetic people, sympathetic to ideas. So that the problem of this, the envy, is reinforced by people who said, if some have great wealth, it must be because it has been taken at the expense of others. How can anybody be that wealthy if he's been honest? But that's the nature of the market process, is that since no one can be forced into a transaction or exchange or a market relationship without their consent and approval and freedom of association, if someone makes a lot of money, whether it be a professional sports figure, whether it be a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates, none of them can have their wealth unless in an act of free exchange, others have enjoyed the service they can provide or their marketing, so much so that it's sold to Bill and it's sold to Bob and it's sold to Sam, because Bill, Bob, and Sam see that life is made better by having that product than not having it. And their few dollars of a purchase, their few dollars of a purchase, their few dollars of a purchase cumulatively add up to the salaries of a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates. But nothing has been stolen from anyone. as long as the producer, the seller, does not receive a privilege, a favor, a protection, a subsidy from the state that in any way twists people's arms or inhibits the competition of those who would like to try against them by doing better in servicing of the consumer, every dollar that a person earns in the marketplace has been done honestly and ethically and honorably. And that understanding is so misunderstood that it causes all of these political, psychological, and envious problems.
Yeah, your example of Steve Jobs is a good one. I mean, that's the thing about a market economy, a genuine market economy, that the only way a person can get wealthy is by serving others. And he serves others by providing a good or a service that people like, they're willing to pay money for. And so a guy like Steve Jobs, I didn't begrudge him at all. He's a multimillionaire. He made my life really nice. iPhones. And I think the greatest invention of my lifetime has been the GPS. Whoever invented the GPS, I mean, I don't care if he's making a lot of money. He's done wonders for me. I don't get lost anymore.
Not just lost, Jacob, but it's hard to believe that there was a time when you'd be driving, looking for where you're trying to go, and you're at the steering wheel, and on front of the steering wheel, you have a map, and you're trying to not run into a car in front of you while trying to read the map. Do I turn left here? What street am I looking for? I mean,
that's true.
That's gone. That's gone.
Yeah, and your glove box was packed with maps from every state.
Exactly.
To get you around. And the other point you made, or another point you made, that I think was very good, is the idea of rights. That's kind of been lost in all this, Richard, that ironically, the Declaration of Independence was written in the same year as Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1776. Yes. And so Jefferson's saying, rights are fundamental, natural, God-given. They pre-exist government. We don't need to be thanking the troops or anybody else in the government for our rights. Our rights don't come from them. Our rights pre-exist these people in the government. And that was a revolutionary notion too. I mean, throughout history, people have always just believed that, of course, government's going to control economic activity and our intellectual activity. The government, why shouldn't the king be entitled to take whatever he wants from us? He's the king. All of a sudden, Jefferson comes along and turns that notion upside down, just like Smith was turning the economic notion upside down. And when you add up those two concepts and you put them together, all of a sudden you've got the concepts of economic liberty, or the concept of economic liberty, which is a fundamental right. And that's what our American ancestors believed. So they bring into existence this bizarre, unusual way of life. Now, we know there were some bad things like slavery and women's rights and so forth, but otherwise there were good sounding principles: sound money, gold and silver coins, no paper money, no Federal Reserve, central bank, no income tax. People kept everything they earned, Richard, for more than 100 years. There was nothing the government could do about it. You kept everything. No IRS returns, no keeping track of your deductions. You made it, you kept it. Open immigration, no drug laws, on and on. I mean, it was just, to me, the most incredible system. And it gave a signal to the rest of the world. Here's your key to ending poverty. And yet, it was abandoned in favor of this welfare state way of life, which really is a variation of socialism. It's based on the concept of taking money from one group of people and giving it to another group. It's based on the concept of government management of the economy. And then you've got the welfare or the warfare state, which is now taking, $850 billion a year of capital out of the pockets of the American people. It's just such a shame. Because like I said earlier, if we had stayed on the same trajectory that our ancestors had established for us, the good founding principles trajectory, the standard of living in this country would be phenomenal.
Yeah, the coincidence of both the Declaration of Independence and Smith's Wealth of Nations should not be lost sight of, as you were emphasizing. Because when Jefferson talked about we hold these truths of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as unalienable, in the pages of Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was published in March of 1776, he talked about a system of natural liberty in which government was limited to basically protection of rights, law enforcement, courts, and national defense, with just a handful of other things that he thought the government should do. But basically, the government would be limited to the securing of liberty from foreign banditry and and deception and fraud. And other than that, individuals were to live freely in free association and open and peaceful competition for mutual gains from trade. That is the core upon which this prosperity, increasingly for the world, has been based over the last now slightly over 200 years. And to lose it would be a tragedy, not just for one country, but for all of mankind.
Yeah, well, we can still recapture it. There's no question about that. And so on that note, Richard, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your support of FFF. If you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, subscribe to our FF Daily, which we strive to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. We've got a monthly journal that we're really pleased with. Been publishing it for 33 years now. It's called Future of Freedom. And we've got the Libertarian Angle here. We have online conferences we do periodically. You can go and check out our video section of our website. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week, and I greatly enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for your good input.
Until next time.